In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, firms had to quickly adapt to a number of changes in the financial markets. As these regulations continued to evolve, market participants needed to make updates and enhancements to their infrastructure without being sure the latest rules would be the final ones. Rather than taking different routes to satisfy all the changes coming your way, we can help you re-examine your infrastructure and optimize operations by taking a holistic approach. Our consulting framework covers diagnostics, analysis to help address inefficiencies related to DTCC products and services, design, helping define and organize operating models and technical architecture, implementation, planning, testing, and coordination of solutions, project management, overseeing initiatives by subject matter experts, integration, support through your onboarding journey.
So hello again, everybody, and moving on. And first of all, welcome to anybody who's just joining the event today. A reminder for everybody that you can ask the panels questions. We've got a lot of people online now, I'm told, and we got a lot of good questions last time, and it really does help to kind of make it a better event. So please use your questions button on the virtual platform. So our next panel is called All Settled for the CSDR. The implementation of CSDR is looming large. We'll hear more about that, I'm sure. As an aside, I went to a Halloween party at the weekend and I thought I'd wear a t-shirt saying CSDR is coming, be very afraid. But then I remembered that all of my friends work in what politicians like to annoyingly call the real world economy, and none of them would have got it. Anyways, I'm not going to digress because we're running a few minutes over. I'll now introduce our panel. Which I understand will include some polling questions for the audience, so look out for those. Our moderator for the session is Sarah Nicholson, who is Senior Partner at Consolo. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining this session entitled All Settled for CSDR. So I think we'll conclude at the end of the session whether we're actually all settled or whether there's more to do. If I can start by asking my panelists to introduce themselves. So if we can go Paul, Dan, Matthew, and then Camille, if you could just introduce yourselves, that'd be great.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, I'm Paul Baybutt. I work for HSBC, and I work in the investment operations outsourcing area, responsible basically for providing middle office services to asset managers. I've been involved with CSDR since well before we even got to some of the production of the RTSs. It was at a very early stage. And have been a representative on the joint industry steering and working groups for CSDR over that period of time.
Hi Sarah, it's Daniel Carpenter. I'm responsible for the regulation and product strategy side of Meritsoft. Meritsoft is part of the Cognizant group. I've been involved in CSDR, I guess, for the last 3 or 4 years when we started designing a solution to handle the penalties and the binds process. And since then, we've been deploying that and enhancing the system and engaging the feedback as to what needs to be done to the application, etc. So that's my role.
Good morning, Sarah. So I'm Matt Johnson, part of DTCC's institutional trade process and solutions business. I've recently moved into a newly formed part of the ITP world, which is called Digital Strategy and Platform Management. And for my sins, I also still have responsibility for industry relations across Europe. Hence why I've been neck deep in CSDR over the last 4 to 5 years.
Hi Sarah, I'm Camille Mckelvey and I work at MarketAxess and I look after business development for our STP business and really focus on the cash and repo markets and driving automation post-trade in that space. Much like my fellow panelists, I've also been heavily involved with CSDR for more years than I care to remember. I think it's probably getting on for, I was just saying before we kicked off, it's probably getting on for a decade. Not sure what we're going to talk about after this, but I'm sure there'll be another reg for us to discuss. So looking forward to chatting today.
Brilliant, thank you. So CSDR has been, as you say, sort of around and been in discussion for a number of years. I think I first came across it, it was something like 2013. So, it was due to come in originally, I think, or sort of introduced in 2014. So, and here we are still talking about it, as you say, Camille. Paul, you've been involved with it sort of from almost the onset. Would you start the session just by giving us a kind of a current status update, where we are, how we've got here, and what the sort of current situation is with CSDR?
Absolutely. I'll start by giving a brief bit of background for those that need to come up to speed. I'm very brief, and then take us through to where we are. We're trying to get settlement discipline, and as I think we saw in the video introduction, as a result of the 2008 financial crisis, there was a number of regulations that were designed to improve the safety and efficiency of security settlements. CSDR was one of them. That's where it originated. We all remember EMIR, MiFID, and SFTR. And CSDR, I think, we can consider to be the last piece of the jigsaw. What is CSDR aiming to do? It's aiming to promote safe and efficient settlement of basically the settlement infrastructure that supports European securities. There's a number of components that improves safety, improves regulation, improves harmonization of rules, and one component that is where we are today, improving the rates of settlement efficiency of the market, and that's why we are effectively here today to talk. We talked about the timing of CSDR. 2014 level 1 was published. We've been working and understanding that since August 2014 when it came out. And we're now moving through periods whereby things like shorter settlement cycles have been implemented. The authorization rules have been implemented, internalization rules have been implemented, and we've got a couple of components left. One is settlement discipline, and the other is the mandatory dematerialization of securities, which is not yet planned, or originally planned for 2025, but could move out since. So settlement discipline, what is settlement discipline? 3 components: settlement reporting, penalties, and mandatory buy-ins. And the industry has been trying to get their heads around how these will be implemented. We all probably know the background to the challenges, and the biggest impact or the biggest concern that the industry has is that mandatory buy-ins are likely to introduce issues that reduce optionality for end investors, raises transaction costs, and severely damages market liquidity. And damage to market liquidity is important because it starts impacting the ability for companies to see market-based finance. It will result again in higher costs to the investor in terms of buying and investing in securities, and it makes it a significant impact for the issuance of less liquid securities and how less liquid securities come to market. In terms of where we are today, we were all due to go live, I think it was back in 2020 originally, with settlement discipline. We saw it delayed until February 2021, and then due to COVID, it was delayed further to 2022. During 2022, ESMA consulted with the market as to the issues raised, particularly around liquidity and the mandatory buy-ins. And there was a large response to that consultation paper. And basically, the Commission decided that there needed to be some tweaks to the regulation. The regulation, there needed to be an impact assessment to the regulation, and the settlement discipline framework needed to be proportionate to the costs of implementation. So, as a result of that review, which was February, published in June, we are awaiting that impact analysis. That impact analysis is not yet to be published. It's due in December, possibly 1st January of 2022. That's led to the big issues for the industry and the uncertainty as to how do we implement something that we don't know what the impact of that review is going to be. Joint trade associations have been lobbying the Commission and lobbying the European Parliament and Council for a decision as to whether mandatory buy-ins particularly would go live. I think the industry is comfortable with the application of penalties and agree that penalties should go live, but are challenging the implementation of mandatory buy-ins. ESMA wrote to the Commission in September asking for a response by the end of October in terms of what will happen in relation to mandatory buy-ins. We haven't really heard anything concrete. However, we are aware that the Commission has been looking at ways to defer the mandatory buy-in element of settlement discipline. Steps were planned for the matter to be discussed on the 20th of October at a trilogue meeting where the DLT pilot regime was going to be used to split the implementation dates of the various components of settlement discipline. As I mentioned before, those components being transaction, failed trade reporting, penalties and mandatory buy-ins. The intention there would be to create a mechanism that allows for mandatory buy-ins to be deferred, but penalties and settlement reporting to be implemented as planned on the 1st of February 2022. Unfortunately, the latest update is that trilogue meeting, the paper that was proposed was not discussed, and therefore we had no firm direction from it. The next opportunity for that paper to be discussed is Monday next week, the 8th of November. Where it is hoped that the presidency will present the paper to the trilogue meeting and for it to be discussed and potentially adopted into the DLT pilot regime. Should it be accepted, we won't know probably for about 2 weeks. It will be at the subsequent trilogue meeting where a decision will be published. And then we expect ESMA to step in with possibly a no action letter. Now, the reason that we would need a no action letter is that there is normally a 3-month review of any proposed regulation. If that is agreed in that mid-November trilogue meeting, that 3-month review would take us beyond the 1st of February. And therefore, on the 1st of February, CSDR would go live, but we would need a no action letter from ESMA to put on hold the application of the buy-in regime. So that's where we are on the main components. Just very briefly for the other aspects of CSDR, penalty testing is live. There's been a few delays on that, which is putting pressure on the market to get it to a state of readiness, and still there is a whole host of Q&A that the Commission needs to answer, which we're hoping to be part of the impact analysis and the report from that impact analysis published in February, that will still lead us to determine how we will implement CSDR in 2022.
Brilliant. That's a great summary, thank you. I'm going to put up a poll question now, just for the audience, while we continue this. So can we have the first poll question, or first poll? Okay. If can anyone see the poll question? Okay, if you can't see, the poll question is up. If you can't see it, I'm being told you'll need to just refresh your screen. So if the delegates can just have a look at the question and respond to that. In the meantime, Camille, from your perspective, so Paul is talking about the possible sort of splitting of the cash penalties and buy-in process. Do you think the market is assuming that it will either get split or we'll get this no action, or do you think people are still preparing as if it will both come in?
I mean, it's obviously all of this uncertainty is very challenging for the market, because we like to have time to prepare, and before we know it, we'll be in December and we'll have year-end code freeze changes and all of those kind of things. So we really haven't got a huge amount of time, but I think that people are of the opinion that it is unlikely that the buy-ins will go ahead. Whether that is a correct assumption or not, obviously we don't know yet. But I from what I gather from our side and from what I'm hearing from people, is that the assumption is that the penalties will go ahead. And Paul obviously spoke about the reporting. So I think the next few months is really needs to be a focus on getting ducks in a row to make sure that the industry is ready for that. I think the general sentiment is that penalties are a good thing, and that it will help to improve settlement rates. We've seen that in the US. We've seen a similar kind of implementation of fines on failed trades and in other markets as well. So I do think that is the sentiment. It will be interesting to see actually if the regulation is decoupled in that way, and we do, the penalties start to happen. Will the regulators then relook at that and just and say, well, perhaps that has a positive enough impact on settlement rates that then do we actually need to look at a buy-in regime? I don't know what number is high enough in terms of settlement rates. Yes, I know the desire is 100% settlement rates. I'm not sure that's realistic, but I think if let's assume that we're in a world where come February, just the penalties go live and the reporting, I think then we should look at that, once it has time to bed in and understand, well, what has that done to the market? What does the market look like now? Have we got closer to where we need to be? And then let's take another look at the buy-in process.
And is it really feasible to think that the regulator might kind of scale back or sort of stop the buy-in? So if the market reaches 99.9% settlement, is the regulator likely to pull back and say, well, there's no need for that buy-in penalty?
Well, maybe they'll recommend that we all move to a blockchain. So and then maybe maybe it's a bit early in the conversation to start talking about DLT and blockchain. But there's another interesting dynamic. But I think it remains to be seen. Really, I think we've got to wait and see.
Absolutely. So we've had the response to the poll question in, and it's quite interesting. It's like, so the question was, how confident are you that CSDR fines and penalties regime will be implemented in February? So what do the delegates think about that, with a clear understanding and readiness from the market? So interestingly, very confident and the market will be ready. Very low response, 5%. Only 5% people think that if both are implemented. 26% say that that they're confident that it will be implemented, but the market won't be ready. By far and away, the largest response is that it seems to be the view that only the settlement fines will be implemented, but the market will not be ready. So I guess that sort of leads us on to, it's an interesting that the delegates think that it will be decoupled and that only the settlement fines will come in, which seems a reasonable assumption, but that the market won't be ready for that element. So, do you think it's, I'm interested in anyone's response. Daniel, what do you think to those results?
I guess it goes sort of, where we think it is actually, I guess. So from a buying's point of view, everyone we speak to is backing the fact it will be delayed, frankly, when you look at the process, or they'll be looking at manual workarounds at an interim basis, which will have its own issue around resourcing, processes and everything else if it goes ahead. And bear in mind, people do have a buy-in process, it's just optional. So it's a volume and a scale issue that's going to create for people. And in this particular audience, I think obviously we can come on to that later on about the opportunities around securities lending and everything else. But so we'll put the buy-ins to one side, that probably will be delayed if they can get the legalese sorted out. I think in terms of penalty preparation, I think, again, a lot of houses were initially reliant on thinking, well, the CSD is going to do it for me. I'll just get deducted money and so forth, and it'll be quite straightforward. And then subsequently, they've sort of got in and said, well, okay, what's the volume going to be? Do I want to validate these fees? How am I going to then pass on the fees to other people if it's not my fault and I'm part of a chain? So there's been more sort of push towards getting ready for it. Certainly from our clients, the settlement discipline side of things, from the penalty side of things, they're well in hand. But like everything, when you start looking at it in detail, you say, well, it could be good to improve that, and where's the choke point going to be, and how can I handle these scenarios? So there's sort of the day one, can I get up and running? Yes. And then there's always the phase two, well, what if, and how do I improve that process and start looking at it? And if binds do come in, then there's the sort of, how do I see what my total exposure and risk is from my settlements on one side and my penalties on one side, and the buys and the sells, and actually having an aggregated view across everything. So it doesn't surprise me, the result. I think settlement fines will come in. Everyone's expecting that. A lot of people are ready. I think some are still very much focused on tactical solutions, not on strategic solutions. I guess is my summary on that one.
So it's just focusing on the penalties, on the assumption that they do come in. You know, is the actual regime practical in terms of its can we implement it? Is it about market participants kind of coming to the table and being ready, or is there any areas of grey or the sort of lack of clarity?
I think data is always going to be a bit of an issue. It's a wholesale industry issue, data, but I mean, there's always going to be an issue around the quality of data, who's providing the right data, and is it the same as the house next door to you, getting the same data, pricing points and everything else. So there's always going to be a bit of a nuance there. I think from some houses, again, it's not always going to be the CSD providing you with data. It may be coming from custodians and everything else. And so it's that aggregation of that data in-house and the method to sort of have a holistic view across all of your books of business. So I think it's well in hand. I think the impacting factor will be data around the outside of it. But in terms of actually systematically addressing it, people have had enough time, and most houses have got something in hand. I don't think anyone's sitting there going, oh, I haven't thought about this yet. I think I was on a panel recently, though, where someone did ask that question right at the end and saying, if I'm looking at it now, what's going to happen? This is about a month ago, and I said, well, you probably have left it a bit late to be looking at it now with 4 months to go. But most houses have been looking at it for quite a long time now.
Yeah, brilliant. So, Matthew, is that what you're seeing from your clients? Do you feel that your clients are ready?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've always been a little bit of a glass half full when it comes to this piece of the regulation, and the further down the line we get, the more in-depth conversations we're starting to have with our client base. I mean, from a DTCC perspective, we've always been specifically focused on the settlement discipline regime piece of the CSDR regulation itself. That's just mainly due to our market position as an infrastructure provider. We can't be bought in, we're not going to buy in, and we won't be penalised and so on. I think from the client conversations we've definitely had over the last, I'll say, 2 years, I mean, the knowledge levels and the levels of expectancy have kind of gone through the roof. I mean, there was always an argument that the buyer side was slightly slower to the table than the banks and the broker dealers. But I think that's massively changing. The trajectory of the whole thing is looking a lot more forward focused and targeted on being ready for February 1st. I mean, obviously the buy-ins have been front and center for everybody, and I think we can all agree that subject has been very well documented, very well discussed, at least over the last couple of years. A lot of the focus our clients have, and some of the points we've put forward to our clients, is also prevention. It's a very simplistic way to view the settlement discipline regime, but a settled transaction can't be penalised, nor can it be bought in. So we started to try to encourage our clients to focus on some of their internal issues, maybe some of their internal gaps that they may have in place. I mean, what we saw a lot of the banks and broker dealers looking at was modelling, what the penalties may look like for them from a cost perspective, from a volume perspective. Who's at fault? Are we at fault? Some believe they're going to be net zero, like they're at fault for just as many fails as they're not at fault for. But also more so for everybody that we engage with, whether that be custodians, buyer sides, sell sides. It's understanding where they still have manual processes or where there's still automation gaps. And we went through a series of scorecard and exercises with our clients to try and highlight fundamental issues where they're maybe not using services and products in entirely the correct way to use them, but how that could be easily remedied to achieve a more automation and straight-through processing. Exception management, again, is key. How well does a firm manage their exceptions internally versus is there a need to look at an off-the-shelf platform or a third-party vendor solution? And also, again, benchmarking of their counterparty, identifying or how do they identify the issues they have today, and how quickly can they resolve them? Obviously, more topically, where's the main root of my trade failures coming from, and who is actually at fault for those failures? Then we start to get more into the nuts and bolts of things, and the firms are looking at their inventory issues, or if they have inventory issues, how accurate or how real time is their inventory view, and if it isn't, how do they solve that? Is it going to be looking as a more strategic approach? Is it going to be increasing stock borrows? Is it going to be increasing repo transactions? Is it, from a buyer side perspective, potentially cancelling a lending agreement so that inventory is always held in-house, and things like that, and so on and so on. And there's various different avenues that the clients are going down. But also, again, something that we have seen definitely ramp up a lot over the last 18 months was the interaction and engagement with the front office. Well, I mean, I think a couple of years back, there was a view that CSDR is, and it is very much an operational regulation. But I think the impact to the front office has now been really highlighted, and there's been the relevant lens and laser focus put on that. I mean, we started to look at the cash equity world, and obviously the standard penalty for a cash equity failure being 1 basis point. We've done an analysis on the average commission sizes and commission rates across European securities markets. I think we've done it in Q1, Q2 2019, so it was some time ago. But the average commission rates range from as little as like 0.7 basis points up until about 5.2 basis points. If you argue the median is 2.5 basis points a trade, that trade fails for 2 days and that sales guy's lost all of his commission. And that's obviously a very good way to get the interest of the front office.
Thanks, Matthew. That's really interesting. It's like, I guess from a securities finance perspective specifically, Camille, has there been any? Has been a different approach, or is there anything specific? Because I guess the securities finance is always going to be part of a chain of transactions. Does that change how we need to approach it?
I think having had just gone through the experience of SFTR, which I know the last panel just spoke about, that the buy side particularly, and others in securities finance have begun to get got themselves used to the regulation, and that was kind of really the first time that the buy side have been exposed in that way for securities financing, really. So I think that kind of moved the needle a little bit, and then I think with CSDR coming down the pipe as well, we've seen firms starting to prepare similarly, very similar to what Matt was just saying. But I think there are some firms that will wait till the very last minute, I'm sure, but I think as a general rule, most are prepared and have been looking at this for quite a long time. And I think that's the same in securities finance. I don't think it's any different. Like you say, we're so intrinsically linked to the cash markets, and you can't really, the two things you can't really decouple. They are intrinsically linked.
I certainly think that the securities finance markets, there is still quite a lot of manual intervention in the transaction itself. So it comes back to Daniel's and Matthew's point about kind of looking at that and standardizing it. And dare I say, SFTR has done us a big favor in many ways in terms of trying to, or moving the market towards much more standardized inputs and standardized kind of data, if you like. So in many ways, I think CSDR will probably help that, although it doesn't necessarily address the number of manual processes in the securities finance kind of process, which is obviously it's in shorter timeframes and a sort of actually exchange off exchange type transactions.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, Sarah. You think about the size of this market and how trillions and trillions of dollars washing around in the system every single day, and there are still a significant amount of manual processes, and that's not just post-trade processes, it's from front to back. And until we fully automate all parts of the chain, I think we are going to struggle as an industry. We need to look at the whole kind of the macro level and all of it, because more risk is introduced, the more manual processes there are. So if an execution is still being agreed by on a Bloomberg chat or some other mechanism, and then it's followed up, and then there's a spreadsheet, and then there's all these other things, then it stands to reason that there is more of a chance that there will be something that goes wrong with the transaction. So I really hope that CSDR coming in will be a catalyst to change some of that. I think we've started to see a little bit of a shift, particularly on the execution side when it comes to securities financing, but it's a slow burn, it seems.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the work that ISLA's been doing in terms of that sort of standardization of processes, which hopefully will drive more automation going forward. But
it's a long journey, isn't it? The automation is nothing; it doesn't happen overnight, and there are so many other demands on technology at the moment. When we speak to the houses, they've got regulations everywhere, let alone reduced settlement cycles, more connectivity, higher volume going through. And dare I mention the interest rate rise that may or may not be pending imminently. These are all things that people have got to look at. And when you start looking at penalties, one of the things we found is talking to people is that yes, they're looking at the penalty side of things, but penalties on CSDR is EU. But outside of that, you've got interest claims globally, where people can start charging interest claims on it. And that was something that used to happen a lot of when the interest rates were high. Obviously, they went down, and therefore people weren't particularly charging interest on their settlements. And then what we're seeing is a resurgence in that interest over the last 18 months is that, with people planning CSDR and penalties, which is to all intents and purposes similar to an interest claim, is that people are saying, okay, fine, we need to get ready for interest claims as well as to handle the non-EU CSDR sort of flows alongside the CSDR flows. You put that into account with the interest rates going up, then there's going to be a bigger impact on everybody going forward. And obviously the volumes are up because of volatility in the markets. Is going to have that impact as well. So going back to the point that Camille was mentioning about automation around claims and securities financing, stock borrow loans, etc. Not particularly in our experience, not particularly industrialized to large scale. There are processes there. But when you start automating that process and then actually doing the claims letters going through and the charges going through and everything else, throw the volume on top of the current process. It's a bit like the buy-ins process. People have a process, but it's very low scale, low volume. So it's how do you scale up to these things and start handling the bigger volumes that go through. So to my mind, there's a huge opportunity for this particular audience around sec lending, especially, with people going and saying, well, okay, if the interest rates are up and everything else, I could make an opportunity. And also, the people who've got liquidity, as Paul was referring right at the beginning, then, where the liquidity is going to be impacted, who's got liquidity and who's got access to the off-market stuff, and then can start making business out of it effectively, or increasing their ability to business volumes and flows and profitability out of it. So they're all things and trends we're beginning to see, probably more so in this year than the previous year. The previous year was more about preparation and discussion around, do we want to do penalties? Do we really have to do it, and arguing about it, and then the buy-ins. Sorry,
it's interesting, and I think in the securities finance market specifically, I think because SFTR has been looming so heavily, it really is only in the last sort of 12 months that anyone's had the budget or the resource to really start focusing more so on the CSDR issues. I'd like to just, I'm going to jump about a little bit here because I'd like to just put the second poll question up for the audience. And so the question is, how ready do you believe your specific firm is for the implementation of the penalties and buy-ins? If people can answer that from a securities finance perspective specifically, that would be great. So I'm just going to ask for that question to be put up. And in the meantime, we've had a question in which I thought, my immediate thought was, this is probably best answered by you, Paul, no pressure. So the question is, do the panel have any thoughts on the approaches being taken by market participants to address the legal issues arising from implementing CSDR? Remediation of trading documents is required under the form of legislation.
Yeah, so I can comment on that, Sarah. In my experience talking to the participants that are engaged in changing their documentation. They're taking an approach to make the minimum changes required at this stage based on the knowledge of what is going to happen at this stage. So there's been various working groups in the industry that have been either representative of their particular groups of clients. There's been work done by the Investment Association, legal group that's looked at the buy-side documentation. There is the AGC that has looked at, that's the Association of Global Custodians, that looked at changes that is required to the global custody agreements, and then AFME have been looking at documentation that is required to be amended by the broker dealers. So work is going across the industry to prepare for the documentation. But the biggest challenge that we've obviously got is, how do you prepare for buy-ins if buy-ins aren't going to happen, and what do you include in that documentation in relation to a subject that we're not pretty clear on. So the approach that firms are taking is to consider what is known. The regulation, or while it may not be desired, a large portion of it is understood. And where that regulation is understood, we're in a position as an industry to prepare documentation or amended documentation in light of what is known. We can't obviously prepare documentation of what is unknown, but if we can get the documentation to a minimum standard or a minimum requirement to be in compliance with what is known about CSDR, then that's a good place to be. And a lot of firms are actually taking that approach. To get that approach rolled out, there's two approaches. Some firms are just amending their terms and conditions, and it will be almost like a note to their clients: this is the changes that we're making. Come back to us if you disagree. Others are actually looking for a positive affirmation from their clients in regards to the changes that they're making. But the changes are very, at this stage, are designed to be as simple as possible to ensure compliance with what is known about the regulation.
And do you think there's a risk that those changes are made, and then as the regulation is clarified and refined, there'll be further amendments required?
That's a clear risk, definitely. That is a clear risk, because and that's why you do the minimum now. So if we do the minimum, as opposed to try and building every aspect that we think could happen, you're increasing the risk that you're going to have to then change them again, February, March, April next year. So the desire is to do what is necessary to be compliant, but not make the exercise and not make the burden on the individual firms and firms' clients too great by going into areas that clearly are going to be potentially changed or amended.
Yeah, brilliant. Hopefully that's answered the question. Thanks for that, Paul. So the responses are in, scores on the doors. So the good news is we've got sort of 21% are either completely ready or almost ready with some outstanding actions. 44%, however, say they've still got loads to do, and 33% say that CSDR doesn't impact the business. I wonder if any of you've got any response to those numbers.
I'd love to know. Yeah, I'd love to know where no, I was just going to say, I'd love to know where it's not impacting their business, because
that's what I was going to touch on. Yeah.
Oh well, yeah, okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, you go for it.
No, go on.
I'd actually like to thank them for coming and listening to us, because if it doesn't impact their business and you're prepared to spend time listening to us, I feel quite flattered.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's that class. I mean, this kind of takes me back to when the UK HMT made the decision not to implement. So my son's decided to join the panel. Thank you, Anthony. When HMT made that decision not to implement the settlement discipline regime in UK markets, and the classic thing we saw was, oh, I'm a UK fund manager, that means I don't have to worry about CSDR anymore. But obviously, if you're transacting in cash securities that are going to ultimately settle a European domiciled CSD, then unfortunately you are in scope. So you may need to get back to your legal and compliance guys to confirm that view. So hopefully those thorough assessments have been done, and those firms are absolutely right. There is no impact, but I would like to kick the tires on that, and I would be encouraging them to do that if I was in that position.
Or do you think, Matt, that maybe everyone's moved their settlement to DTCC and that's why they're not in scope anymore?
I won't provide a comment on that, but that could be a possibility.
But I think if you're in the securities lending side of things, again, if you are lending out, then you could be failing on the other side, where there's a settlement cycle there that you may not necessarily think about as I'm lending something, but actually, if that fails to come back in on time and everything else, there is an impact, a direct impact to you that some people may or may.
It's that chain, isn't it? And,
yeah.
And I know it's been discussed, a hell of a lot in regards to the buying piece and the buying chain. But and it comes back to that manual piece. I mean, those manual clients, I believe, are going to be the ones that are really going to bring some problems to everybody, because it only takes a manual client to be in that chain, and they don't have transparency, foresight, automation to be able to deal with it quick enough. All of a sudden, that causes that ripple effect all the way through that chain to someone that was at no fault at all.
And I think as well, I know you Daniel, you touched on interest claims, and you know the kind of the way that works today on a best efforts relationship basis, and all of that's going to go away when CSDR comes in, because you haven't got the option to say, oh no, I won't charge you for that, I won't claim you for that. There isn't going to be that option. So I think that's going to, that's also going to change things a little bit. Maybe that's why firms don't think there may be in scope, because maybe today they're not seeing fines, and they're not.
It's a nature. No, I agree. I mean, and I think that's why interest claims is coming up as a more and more common topic with us. Is that, and I'm going to jump onto one of my favourite topics, which is tax. But when I think about FTTs, if people start generating revenue out of something, other people jump on the bandwagon and sort of say, well, okay, France has done it, Spain's done it, Italy's done it. Now we're going to do it because there's a revenue generation from this particular thing for the governments in that particular instance. If you're on interest claims and you're being penalised in Europe, then if a CSDR fails and penalties, why wouldn't you start charging interest, especially with interest rates going up, and it's an acceptable way of doing it? And it'll be, well, I'm going to get penalties on one side, interest claims on the other one. So, why wouldn't I start generating revenue from a bank or in the financial institution? So I think people are going to start applying far more interest claims than they've been seeing in the last 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I guess, if you're a sort of classic lender, you could be sitting there thinking, well, I lend my long position so I can always settle, and, the returns, if they fail, that's the borrower's problem and not mine. But of course, it goes back to those manual processes and that quality of data, because, you may be long of the position, but if your SSIs are wrong, and we all know about the manual processes around SSIs in securities lending, you could be on the end of a failing transaction. So I think. I was just going to jump on that one, because again, I think from the audience's view would be interesting that if you're lending at the moment, some people are going to say, well, the penalty is cheaper than the stop borrow loan, and therefore I may just absorb the penalty and carry on with that one. So it then becomes, for the sec lending side of things, there may be the view of, well, there's a volume going up on one side, so do I need to review my pricing, because it's a volume versus price point, because I may be able to reduce my pricing to make it more affordable to borrow and everything else, rather than do the penalty, but I'll get more volume. So I'm actually still going to get, in terms of profitability and volume coming in, value coming through, I'm still going to get it, but I need to review my pricing point, because there's options here for me now, or I need to take into consideration. And that brings us on to a really interesting point, Daniel, because if we sort of broaden it back out to the cash markets, and prevention is better than curing the cash market. So presumably we're going to see increased opportunity in securities lending in order to protect people against the buy-ins and penalty or settlement fails broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I guess that's the point I was beginning to get into there, is that you've got options here as to what you do, and whether you want volume or price, or income. And then I think the other bit we've got to think about is, when I'm thinking as a relationship, am I direct with the CSD, or am I going through an agent? So from that perspective, I've now got to deal with 2 different people communicating with me. I've then got to think about the communication of the claims process ongoing. Our background has always been in claims management and interest claims, as everyone knows. So it's a case of how do I follow that chain through the cycle once I've done the aggregation. But interesting in sec lending, I guess the contractual relationships, and I'm not an expert on these sort of things, but you have relationships where obviously contractually, can I identify something, come to you and say, look, you are going to be, therefore I can lend you something. And there have been relationships where maybe you can't do that. You can't approach someone because you shouldn't be using that data to your knowledge to go out and say, there's something coming down the line, you may be failing with something. So it's just one of those points, again, it's been discussed when we've been talking to clients and prospects about how we can manage that. And then I think the other bit is, obviously you're doing a daily sort of communication process, a daily process with a monthly payment cycle that's going on. What's the consideration around netting and offsetting of other charges? Could you be saying, well, okay, I've got all these net fees in here, and can I aggregate fees and offset them against the other fees? So there's a sort of a ripple effect of all these things. I'm extrapolating it several steps past what people need to do for February, but I'm just looking at the broader picture and how people want to address these things. But I think certainly within securities lending, our conversations lead us to believe everyone's considering it as an opportunity to look at it and provide a service.
And on that front, Daniel, I mean, obviously we started to look at like the overlap and the intrinsic nature of financial regulation. We've mentioned SFTR, and obviously I see CSDR and SFTR as quite intrinsically linked. Obviously, if you're borrowing more to cover failed positions or lending more, obviously then that brings you into scope for enhanced transaction reporting, and that's got its own pitfalls and processes. Do you think that this has led operational teams from the financing sides of the business, which have always been, I mean, from a pure operations perspective, they've always been really separate to the core kind of securities, equities, fixed income, FX kind of side of the operations flow? And do you think just the nature of, more borrowing, enhanced borrowing, more claims, can we offset claims against our financing rates? Do you think that's going to eventually, or has it already brought the ops teams closer, or will it just force those ops teams to work a lot more closely?
I think it will force them categorically. Or if you're running a business, you want to look at it holistically. You don't want to be looking at, most regulation in our experience, again, is what can we do to comply? Going back to Paul's comment about, can we just do the minimum bit to make sure we comply because the rules are going to change anyway. So there's always the impact on ops, which is day one. How do I make sure I comply with what I have to do as a sort of an absolute minimum? And that's always gets pushed down the line and delayed. It's sort of, there's always a budget and a project for every year. And this is the one that sort of got delayed till this year or last year. But in terms of the coming together of the different divisions within an institution, so not just the ops people, but the finance people, the stock loans and everything else, we are definitely beginning to see that come together. And people saying, well, okay, it's not just an ops problem, guys. That there's a financial, there's a risk, there's an opportunity, and how do we pull these things together? But I would still say there's still a big segregation between the true front office and the back office. I think it's more the back office with some of the supporting areas and the financial bits coming into it, as opposed to the front office guys jumping in and being part of a project team. But to my mind, they should always be part of the equation. It's not just that ops have got the problem to settle it and sort it. It's interesting, again, if you think about the allocation of costs, because the way banks are looking at in terms of receivables and payables and income collection is it's the allocation back upstream now. A lot of it used to go on ops, and ops had to pick up the tab, and that was just part of the thing. And actually, as they're trying to look at the profitability of different business lines of the institutions, they're now saying, can you do allocations of cost, please? So it's not just a bank, their cost, our cost against the counterparty. It actually is the allocation of the cost back upstream to the divisions that are failing, the ones who are, you're failing, so I want to put it on your cost center. It shouldn't just be seen in ops, and then it makes them more accountable, which means they'll improve their best practice potentially to make sure they're putting the right data in and everything else to do it. And look at the counterparties that fail. If you look at the analytics you can get off this, it's quite impressive that you're going to be able to say, well, okay, these are the people who fail all the time. What about, maybe I should be trading more with these counterparties than these counterparties because I'm going to get a better result and I get better settlement on time. And going back to your point about thin margins being eroded by daily penalties, we can then sort of look at that and address it. So the analytics you get by managing all of this is very insightful.
Yeah, it comes back to that front office impact again, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's where they should be looking at it, and maybe even just an oversight view on the system to say, what are the penalties today, and which counterparties are causing me more pain than other. But again, one of the things we talked about, Matt, historically was around interactions, and Camille as well, is how you can put these things in and do instant messaging communication. And I think we haven't touched on that in this conversation, but it's that sort of ability to say, well, okay, I've got something to manage now, rather than picking up a phone or doing an email. How can I do instant messaging and communication with counterparties to say, look, we've got a problem, we need to fix it quickly because there's a big fine behind it, and it could be either party initiating that, but communicating it and having a full audit trail behind it as well is going to be important.
Yeah, it perplexes me that there's still folk emailing and faxing as ways of communication for really time sensitive and and finance sensitive issues.
Yeah. No, well, it's. I think there's a lot of stuff to aggregate, and you can. I think they would argue. The argument would be that, well, okay, we haven't got all the data we need in one place to start that communication. Otherwise, you're going to be plugging in 15 different systems. So again, when you can, it's like a single pane of glass, which is what we talk to clients about, is having everything in one place. Then you can communicate, and some people may want to go through route A or route B or fax or email, but at least you can start controlling it centrally. If you do it as point-to-point systems, the cost and the management and the oversight and the timeline is exponential.
I think that's a real challenge in the securities finance business, because I think from an asset manager's perspective, who might be lending, they'll either be lending directly or through a custodian, and so that business is sort of not in their core systems. It's usually on a separate platform or a separate, or within their custodial network platform, and so it's a real challenge. To your point, Matthew, about bringing that kind of operations all in together and managing this situation across the full chain. I think it's it's doable, but as you said, Daniel, I think it's we're at the very early stages of bringing all of that together and having a kind of a sensible kind of overview of all of it within a firm, let alone sort of across counterparties and across business more broadly. Camille, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think the guys have covered it. I'm really interested to see the next poll results, actually. The next poll question, if we've got time.
We don't have time to put it up as such, but some attendees have actually answered it already. So we've had sort of slightly smaller response, but at the moment, so the question was, how do you believe CSDR will impact the securities finance business? And we have interesting 27% say they'll see a significant increase in volume, and the same 27% say there'll be a decrease in volume. So just over 50% think that there'll be a significant or some increase in volume. It's really split. 18% say there'll be no impact whatsoever.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? I know what sort of Daniel was touching on about it being cheaper to foul than to settle, so there might be some sort of arbitrage going on there, but then on the other side it might be too expensive to lend to risk lending out your assets. So which is probably why we've got that split result, because there's a similar way to which I would look at it. I don't think we are going to know just yet, but it's interesting that the industry is equally split.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the title of this panel is All Settled for CSDR, and what's very apparent from everything you've all said is that we're very far from settled for CSDR. There seems to be a lot of work and a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, I guess. There's clearly a requirement for greater clarity. I mean, as we sit here now, we don't even know whether the buy-ins will come in February. Okay, there's it seems to be a general consensus that they're unlikely to, but clearly lots of areas to cover. And I guess it's one of those types of regulation with the penalties that will come in, and the market will do what it needs to do to get through February, and then over the course of the next 12 months or so, I guess, the efficiencies as we begin to understand some of these impacts and see some of these changes in the industry, whether that's increased volumes or it not impacting securities finance at all, however it starts to impact, then the developments will occur to enable more efficiency and more effective management. So I think it just remains. I'm just going to thank the panel. Clearly the session has concluded that we're far from all settled for CSDR. There's lots of areas that we need to know further information on, it sounds to me, Camille, like we'll be talking about CSDR for some time to come.
Keeps us all busy. Good.
Matt will be happy.
Exactly.
And on that note, Sarah, thank you. I think that was a great panel session. Just like the first one, very, very, very interesting. And certainly from my point of view, I learned a lot through that one. So thank you to Sarah and the rest of the panel. And we will now move on. So we're going to have a short break now, and then I'll be back in a few minutes to introduce the next session, which will be on collateral management. Thank you.
The new CSDR settlement discipline regulations impacts the whole of the financial services industry settling trades within the EU. Whether you are buy side, sell side, a custodian, or a market infrastructure house. We've applied our 20 years' experience of providing solutions to the financial services industry to create the ideal turnkey solution for CSDR automation. And we have multiple global clients currently onboarding in preparation for the regulation deadlines. Whether your focus is on penalties, buy-ins, or overall fails management, acting now means you will be compliant with a very stable, safe and secure product from the market leaders in operational solutions for claims verification, reconciliation and compliance. In addition to our CSDR solutions core capabilities, our platform includes a host of key CSDR features to ensure an integrated workflow. Our modular system comes pre-configured, and its modifiable nature means it's also future-proofed. So if CSDR rules change, the system can quickly adapt, facilitating your continued compliance. Like all of our solutions, it's flexible, robust, cost-efficient, and compatible with over 250 other market solutions, and it is built to be completely transparent for governance, risk, and compliance purposes. Designed to deploy both locally and in the cloud, it allows you to onboard quickly and easily across your entire organization. With such a powerful and comprehensive solution available, you don't need to wait around to see what others are doing, or to invest huge resources to build your own system. Just come and talk to us today to learn more about the #1 modular solution for CSDR.